He was just a puppy, barely breathing, half frozen, tied to a tree with wire and silence. No food, no warmth, just a cruel goodbye written in the snow. And no one came, until she did. A former Army combat medic, haunted by loss, hidden away in the frozen woods of Montana, Grace Whitaker didn't expect to find a life worth saving that morning. But what happened next will restore your faith in healing, hope, and the quiet power of love. Do you remember the first animal that changed your life? Tell us in the comments. Share their name, their story, and what they meant to you. And if you believe that no animal should ever be abandoned or forgotten, hit that subscribe button. Because this isn't just about survival, it's about second chances. And some stories never leave your heart. Bozeman, Montana was cloaked in white silence the morning it began. A brutal storm had rolled through the mountains overnight, leaving the pine-covered slopes buried under a thick quilt of snow. The wind had quieted now, but the air still carried its bite, crisp and sharp as a razor. Trees groaned under the weight of ice, and the trails winding through the forest behind the outskirts of town had vanished beneath drifts tall enough to swallow a grown man's knees. It was the kind of cold that seeped into bones, the kind that made even memory shiver. Grace Whitaker, 35, moved through the woods with the steady, cautious steps of someone trained to expect the worst in every shadow. She was tall and lean, her olive skin pale from months without sun, her dark brown hair twisted into a loose braid tucked under a wool cap. Her eyes, steely gray, had the weary, scanning alertness of a former soldier. Scars, both visible and unseen, traced her life like faded coordinates. Grace had once been a combat medic with the U.S. Army, stationed in Afghanistan. What she saw there, what she lost, never quite left her. The greatest weight of all was the death of her younger brother, Kyle, in a mortar blast. She had been less than 60 feet away, too far to reach him in time, too late to make it matter. That guilt became a silent lodger in her chest, a constant presence in the quiet hours. Since returning stateside, she had withdrawn from nearly everyone, choosing solitude in a remote cabin tucked deep in the snow-laced woods. That morning, she had set out only to gather fallen branches fuel for the cast-iron stove that kept her small home from turning to ice. The forest, despite its beauty, held no comfort. It was survival terrain, not a sanctuary. As she bent to retrieve a branch splintered by the wind, a sound stilled her. Faint, almost imaginary. Not the creak of snow or rustle of deer. No, it was something weaker. A sound like air catching in a throat. She straightened, pulse ticking up, ears straining. Again, a whimper, broken and breathless. It was coming from deeper in the thicket, past a tangle of frozen brush and ice-laden saplings. Grace followed it, instincts kicking in before reason could protest. She found the source beneath an old spruce, its trunk warped and split at the base. A small shape lay half-buried beneath a mound of disturbed snow. Gray fur, curled tight against the cold. A rope, frayed and crusted with ice, bit into its neck, tethering it to a root like discarded luggage. Grace dropped to her knees, brushed the snow back. What she uncovered made her breath hitch. It was a puppy. A German shepherd, no more than 8 weeks old, ribs showing beneath patchy fur matted with mud and pine needles. One ear was bent oddly, a raw red scrape marked his hind leg. His eyes were closed, and for a terrible second she thought he was already gone. But then, his tiny chest moved, shallow and rapid. "God," she murmured. Her voice was hoarse in the cold. "You poor thing." Without hesitation, she slipped her arms around his trembling frame, feeling the heat, or lack thereof, beneath her coat. He didn't resist. He barely reacted. She stood, clutching him against her chest, and turned back toward the cabin, moving faster now, her boots crunching hard through the snow, eyes scanning for signs of movement. There was none. Whoever had left the pup here hadn't just abandoned him. They'd meant for him not to be found. The cabin appeared through the trees like a shadowed promise. Modest, built from pine logs blackened by age and smoke, it stood as a fortress of isolation. Grace shouldered the door open with her hip and kicked it shut behind her. She placed the pup on the old wool blanket beside the fire, then knelt beside him. He didn't cry, not once, only shivered. She stoked the embers, added split wood, and fanned the flames until the room warmed. Then she filled a canteen with hot water, wrapped it in a flannel shirt, and placed it beside his body. In the dim light, the scars became more visible. The rope had left bruises. His front paw was twisted slightly. A bruise, maybe a fracture. Grace swallowed hard. She had seen trauma before, more than her share, but something about this small, defeated body made her chest ache. From a drawer, she retrieved a worn photograph creased at the corners, faded from time. Kyle's smile still lived in that picture, caught forever in the sun of some forgotten summer. She placed it quietly on the mantel just above the hearth. "You'd have liked him," she said softly, glancing back at the puppy. "He was always the one who brought strays home." As the hours passed, she stayed beside the pup, wiped his nose, dipped her finger into sugar water and touched it to his lips, spoke softly about nothing and everything. He stirred once, barely lifting his head, then collapsed again. She took that as a good sign. Night fell early, as it often did in the Montana winters. The snow began again, thick flurries coating the windows like fogged glass. Grace settled into the old rocking chair beside the fire, a blanket over her knees. The puppy, now wrapped in another flannel shirt, twitched in his sleep. She studied him in the glow of firelight. So small, so silent. But he was breathing, and that, for now, was enough. She hadn't named him yet. Somehow, naming felt like a promise, a hope she hadn't dared claim. But in the quiet hush of the room, as wind howled outside and memories whispered between shadows, one word came to her. Ash. It fit. Something burned. Something left behind. But also something still warm. "Ash," she repeated aloud, and this time the puppy's ear twitched. She smiled, just barely, then leaned back, closed her eyes, and let the fire hold them both. The morning after the storm broke crisp and clear, casting a pale blue light over the snow-covered forest surrounding the cabin. Frost coated the window panes like a second skin, and the silence outside was absolute. Inside, however, warmth stirred, uneven, faint, but real. Ash lay nestled beside the hearth, his breathing shallow but more rhythmic than the night before. His head rested against a flannel-covered canteen filled with warm water. Though his eyes remained closed, a quiet resilience seemed to pulse beneath his still frame. Grace Whitaker sat cross-legged near the fire, watching the pup like someone afraid to look away. Her hands, though calloused and marked by old field scars, moved gently as she adjusted the edge of the towel covering his hind legs. The faintest twitch of his ear made her freeze, not from fear, but from a hope so fragile she hardly dared to name it. There had been no sound from him since the night before. No whimpers, no barks, just breath and stillness. But now, watching the subtle movement of his chest, Grace began to believe just a little that Ash might make it. She stood slowly, careful not to disturb the quiet bubble around him, and stepped over to the drawer beneath the mantel. From it, she pulled a folded piece of soft, worn fabric, an old field bandage, yellowed at the edges and clean, but stained by time. It had been part of her kit in Afghanistan. Used once, she had never thrown it away. Unfolding it, Grace sat at the dining table, threading a fine needle with red thread. Her fingers worked with the muscle memory of habit as she began to embroider one word in small, neat letters. Ash. She stitched slowly, each pass of the needle into the cloth a kind of ritual. It was an act of ownership, yes, but also an act of reverence for life, for survival, for something to hold on to. By the time she finished, the fire had burned hotter and brighter. She laid the cloth beside the pup, letting the warmth of it mingle with the heat from the hearth. Ash didn't stir, but his tail barely more than a damp strand of fur twitched once. Grace watched him in silence, then exhaled long and low. She walked into the back room of the cabin, where her cot and shelves were lined with books, field journals, and one box an old ammo crate repurposed to hold the remnants of another life. She opened it, retrieving a leather-bound notebook with a frayed elastic band and a smooth black pen tucked into its spine. She hadn't written in it in nearly a year, not since her last attempt at reaching out to Valor Haven, the veteran support program she had attended briefly after returning home. She had left early, disappearing into the wilderness like a ghost no one missed. But the notebook had remained. She turned to a blank page and wrote, "To the team at Valor Haven. I don't know if this counts as progress. I'm not sure I care. But today, I woke up and didn't feel empty. Not entirely. There's a reason. He's maybe 8 weeks old. Ribs like twigs. A coat like ash. Someone left him tied to a tree in the middle of a storm and decided he wasn't worth saving. But I found him. Or maybe he found me. I thought I was done rescuing things. I thought I had nothing left. But now I find myself holding a dropper to his mouth every hour and whispering words I haven't spoken aloud in years. I don't expect a reply. I probably won't send this. But writing it down feels like breathing again, and that's something." She paused, tapping the end of the pen against the paper. Then, without signing it, she folded the page and tucked it into the back pocket of the journal, just behind an old photograph of Kyle in uniform, his grin wide, his boots too big for his feet. Back in the main room, Ash stirred again. This time his head lifted slightly. His tongue flicked over his nose, dry and searching. Grace dropped to her knees beside him. "Hey," she said gently, brushing the flannel aside. "You're still with me." She reached for the sugar water dropper and eased a few drops into his mouth. His lips trembled, then closed instinctively. He swallowed. Not much, but enough to make her heart catch. "There you go," she whispered. "That's how it starts." The cabin was still. The wind outside had faded into distant whispers between the trees. It was a rare calm. Grace wrapped the old military jacket tighter around her frame and sank to the floor next to Ash, sitting shoulder to stone with the hearth. As she sat there, time unwound itself. No memories came to push against her peace. No flashbacks, just firelight. Just quiet, just a pup breathing beside her. Later, as evening slid in without sound, she took the cloth with Ash's name on it and carefully folded it into a small square. She placed it into the wooden box beside the fire, where she kept the few things she considered sacred. Not because she needed to protect it, but because she wasn't quite ready to let go of how it made her feel. Hope, not in blinding flashes, not in sweeping change, but in the flicker of warmth beside a fire, in a heartbeat that was almost lost, in a name embroidered in red. Ash didn't bark that night. He didn't even open his eyes again. But his breathing was a little stronger, and Grace, without realizing, slept in the chair beside him, her hand resting just lightly on his side. The morning sun filtered softly through the cabin windows, drawing long golden streaks across the floorboards and the wool blanket where Ash lay curled. He was awake now, not fully, but enough. One eye open, a paw stretched forward. Breath still rattling, but less fragile than before. Grace Whitaker sat nearby, sipping lukewarm coffee from a tin mug, her boots still damp from stepping outside to fetch more firewood. Ash turned his head slightly at the sound of the creaking floor. His gaze found her, unfocused at first, then sharper, just a flicker of recognition. Grace felt something shift in her chest, a quiet loosening she didn't expect. "Well, good morning, soldier," she murmured, setting her mug aside and kneeling beside him. His tail thudded, once slow but intentional. "That's more than you gave me yesterday." She adjusted the blanket around his body, careful of the bruising near his flank. His ears were still flat, his posture still tense, but he no longer trembled uncontrollably. That was enough to keep her going. Grace sat cross-legged on the rug beside him and exhaled through her nose. "You're not the first quiet one I've sat with," she said softly. "Kyle never made a lot of noise either. Not when he was scared." Her voice drifted into the air between them, low and steady, as if she were reading a memory aloud. "He used to freeze up when Dad got loud. Wouldn't cry, wouldn't run. Just sit there. I'd pull him behind the couch and talk about faraway places until the shouting stopped." She glanced at Ash. His breathing had slowed. His eyes closed again, but his brow twitched slightly. Grace wasn't sure if he understood her words or just the rhythm of her voice. She continued anyway. He was a wreck growing up. But then he joined up. Same as me, wanted to serve. Be somebody. Funny, huh? She smiled without humor. He came home once with a busted lip and this stupid grin. Said he'd tackled a guy twice his size during training. I told him he was an idiot. He said, yeah. But I'm your idiot. Ash stirred again. Not in pain, more like something beneath the surface had been nudged. Grace's hand drifted to his head, fingers threading gently through the soft fur behind his ears. You remind me of him, she said. Too small to take the hits you've already seen, but still here. That night, as the wind picked up again beyond the cabin walls, Grace woke to a sound she hadn't heard in years, a whimper. Not loud, not long, but sharp enough to pierce the quiet. She sat up quickly, blanket falling to the floor. Ash was twitching in his sleep, paws paddling softly against the blanket, breathing quick and uneven. Then the cry came again, muffled, strangled, panicked. A dream, clearly, but it cut through Grace like shrapnel. She knelt beside him, one hand on his side. It's okay, she whispered. You're safe. Nobody's going to hurt you here. But he didn't wake. His body jerked slightly with another muffled sound, almost like choking. Grace leaned down, pressing her forehead gently to his. It's not real. Not anymore. You're not there. You're with me. Eventually the tremors stopped. Ash's body went still again, save for the rise and fall of his breath. Grace sat beside him the rest of the night, her eyes fixed on the fire but her mind racing with questions. She knew trauma, had memorized its many faces. She saw it in his sleep, in the way his body folded inward, in the way he startled at the slightest sound. By dawn, she made a decision. Bozeman was a half-hour drive down winding roads, but she knew someone who might help. Dr. Nolan Reyes ran the town's small veterinary clinic on the edge of Main Street. The building was nothing grand, a single-story structure painted pale green, with wood siding worn by years of snow and sun. A faded wooden sign above the door read, Reyes Veterinary Care, compassion in every step. Grace hadn't seen him in years, but she remembered him. He had been the unit vet during their base rotation back in 2016, a civilian contractor sent to monitor military dogs overseas. She only remembered his face because of one incident, the night a bomb went off at the perimeter fence. A young soldier had been pulled out of the blast zone by his K-9 partner. Grace had stabilized the kid. Reyes had worked through the night to save the dog. She still remembered the way he'd spoken to the animal, not as a pet, but as a brother in arms. Now, standing at the clinic's threshold, Ash bundled in her arms beneath a thick fleece jacket, she hesitated before knocking. The door opened before her fist landed. Reyes stood in the doorway, a man of about 50. Latino, medium height, solid frame softened only slightly with age. His black hair was streaked with silver, and his square jaw carried a 5 o'clock shadow like a permanent badge. He wore a dark Henley shirt under a quilted vest and jeans dusted with hay. At first his eyes widened in surprise. Grace Whitaker. She offered a curt nod. I need your help. He stepped aside immediately, motioning her in. Come on. Set him here. Inside smelled of pine cleaner and warm fur. The room was quiet, bathed in natural light from the skylight above the table. Grace placed Ash gently on the padded exam surface. Reyes examined him with a calm, practiced touch. He said nothing for a moment, just watched Ash breathe. Then he looked up. Where'd you find him? Off Mill Creek Trail. Tied to a root. His jaw clenched. People do that more than I want to admit. He gently examined the pup's limbs, feeling along each bone. He's healing. Slow, but steady. I'll give you some antibiotic drops, vitamins, and a mild anti-inflammatory for his joints. Grace nodded. He paused, giving her a look both curious and cautious. You still carrying field gear? Some. He smiled slightly. Thought so. You stitched up Rodriguez under fire, didn't you? Back at Camp Nathaniel. Grace's brows lifted. You remember that? Hard to forget someone who cussed louder than the explosion. He chuckled softly, then turned back to Ash. You haven't changed much. She didn't respond. I'm glad you brought him in. He cried in his sleep, she said quietly. It sounded like something he'd learned, not something he was born with. Reyes's face softened. Then he needs time, and someone to make him feel safe. I'll try. You already are. When she left the clinic, Ash nestled in her arms once more. Grace felt a strange steadiness in her step, a feeling like structure returning to something long crumbled. The snow had crusted over in the days since the storm, forming a brittle shell that crunched underfoot as Grace and Ash walked along the edge of the forest clearing behind the cabin. The wind had calmed, but the cold clung stubbornly to the earth, and long icicles hung from pine boughs like warning signs from nature itself. It was late afternoon, and the pale sun threw a fragile light across the ground, giving everything a faint blue shimmer. Ash walked ahead of her on a loose lead, his gait still uneven but growing stronger with each day. His coat was beginning to fill in again. Patches once dull and matted now gleamed faintly with a healthy sheen. He wasn't fully healed, not yet, but the spark in his step had returned and his ears perked every time she said his name. Grace kept one hand in her coat pocket, fingers brushing the old fabric patch where she'd once stitched Kyle on her brother's uniform. Ash pulled gently on the lead, nose to the ground. Then he stopped. His body stiffened. Grace crouched beside him. What is it, Ash? He whined softly, sniffing furiously around the base of a crooked pine tree, its trunk twisted from years of wind and frostbite. The snow here was disturbed more than the casual shuffle of paws and boots. Grace knelt, brushing aside a layer of frost. Her hand closed around something coarse. A rope, frayed at the ends, stained with something dark old blood. She turned it over in her hands slowly, unease crawling along her spine. A few inches away, half buried in the crusted snow, was a small chunk of plastic. The broken clasp of a dog collar, one side still marked with tiny worn letters. Pro. She squinted. Proctor. Preston. It was too damaged to read fully. Then, caught in a frozen root, she found it, small, square, metal, a tracker tag, no larger than a thumbnail with a ridge of numbers etched into its back. A microchip module snapped from its housing. Her breath fogged as she stared at it. She stood slowly, Ash now sitting close beside her, tail still, eyes on her face. We're going to see Dr. Reyes again, she said. The drive into Bozeman was quiet. Ash sat on the passenger seat, wrapped in a folded fleece blanket. Grace kept glancing his way, as if he might say something, or as if she already understood the words he couldn't speak. Reyes was just locking the clinic door for the evening when she pulled up. He wore a thick wool coat, his stethoscope still slung around his neck like an afterthought. His dark eyes lit with recognition when he saw them. Back already? He said, walking up to the truck. Grace held out the metal chip. We found this near where I found him. It looks like a detached tracker. Could you check if it still scans? Reyes raised an eyebrow, then nodded. Inside, he guided them quickly into the side exam room and turned on a handheld scanner. Grace handed over the tag without a word. He passed the scanner over the chip once, twice. On the third pass, the device emitted a soft beep. Well, I'll be, Reyes murmured. It still works. Let's see. He tapped the device's screen and read the number, then moved to the corner desk and booted up a database terminal. Grace waited, arms crossed, eyes flicking toward Ash, who lay curled beside her feet, gaze calm but alert. Reyes spoke again, slower this time. He's registered. The ID matches a litter bred last year just outside Bozeman. He turned the monitor slightly. Owner's name is Martin Keller. Lives in town, or did anyway. Let me double-check. Grace's jaw clenched slightly. Can you tell if he reported the dog missing? Reyes shook his head. Not from this screen. But I can file a vet report and flag it for local authorities. Want me to? Before Grace could answer, the front door opened with a low creak, followed by firm, booted steps. A woman's voice called out, low but steady. "Reyes!" I saw the light. Dr. Reyes leaned into the hallway. "Back here, Sheriff." Grace turned as the woman entered, tall, angular, her stride purposeful and her presence immediate. Sheriff Ellie Madsen, around 45, with sharp cheekbones and shoulder-length blonde hair tucked behind her ears beneath a felt hat. Her uniform was clean but not pristine, well worn at the elbows and boots caked with snow. Her face was plain, weathered, with eyes that had seen too much but still carried a fierce clarity. "Grace Whitaker," she said after a beat, nodding slightly. "Didn't think I'd see you again in town." Grace nodded in return. "Wasn't planning on it." Ellie stepped closer, squatting slightly to glance at Ash. "Is this the one?" Yes." Reyes filled her in quickly on the chip, the location, and the records. Ellie listened without interrupting, then stood with a thoughtful frown. "Makes sense. I've had a few reports of strange activity near the north campgrounds. People said they heard dogs crying. Thought it was coyotes." Grace frowned. "You think he came from there?" Ellie glanced at her. "Could be. That land's leased by seasonal workers. A few trailers, mostly men looking for day jobs. We've had trouble before. Fights, animal complaints." Ash whined softly. Ellie crouched again, resting a hand near but not on him. "You've got a survivor here. Most wouldn't have lasted a night." Grace didn't reply. "I'll open a formal case," Ellie said. "But Grace, if you remember anything from deployment, if something about this feels off, let me know. We've got more than one animal missing lately." Grace looked at her directly. "If there's something going on out there, I'll help you find it." Ellie gave her a hard, appreciative look. "Your mom used to say you were the stubborn one." Grace allowed a brief smile. "Still am." They left the clinic just after dusk, the snow glowing under a sky streaked with pink and silver. Ash was quiet on the ride home, but his body leaned into her as the truck rumbled back up the mountain. At the cabin, Grace placed the recovered items into a metal tin she labeled, "Ash Found Evidence." She tucked it on the shelf above the fireplace, next to the photo of Kyle and the stitched cloth with Ash's name. She stood for a long moment in the quiet of her home, staring into the flames. She didn't have all the answers yet. But now, at least, she had direction. And she wasn't alone. The morning began with a knock-sharp, sudden, harmless. But Ash didn't see it that way. 1 second he was resting near the stove, head curled into his paws as soft snow fell outside. The next, his body jerked upright, tail tucked, ears flat, eyes wide and wild. Before Grace could cross the room, he had scrambled into the narrow gap beneath the table, trembling so hard the floorboards seemed to echo it. "It's just the mail, Ash," Grace said gently, but her voice caught. She crouched near him, reaching out with a calm, open hand, letting him smell her skin. He didn't growl, he didn't bark, but he didn't move either. He just stared at the door as if it might open and bring something worse than winter. She'd noticed it before, his reaction to footsteps that were too loud, voices that dropped suddenly into anger. He didn't flinch at the wind or thunder. But the weight of human noise boots on wood, hands on doors, left him rigid, breath shallow, eyes glassy with memory. Grace sat beside him in silence until he finally edged out, his body low, muscles taut. She didn't try to coax him. She just waited. That afternoon, she made the call. The Maple Ridge Therapy Center was on the other side of town, tucked between a playground and an old Baptist church. The building was small, 1 story, painted soft blue with white shutters and wind chimes that swayed quietly from the porch awning. The sign out front read, "Maple Ridge, Child Wellness and Trauma Recovery." Grace hadn't been back since she stopped volunteering 3 years ago. The walls inside still smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and craft glue. Murals of smiling animals and floating balloons covered the hallway, cheerful but faded in the corners. They were met in the lobby by Rachel Kim, a therapist in her early 30s with smooth black hair pulled into a low ponytail. She wore a mustard-yellow sweater, round glasses, and a silver bracelet that clinked softly as she gestured toward the inner playroom. Her tone was warm but grounded, the kind of voice that calmed chaos before it started. "I heard you were back," she said to Grace, her eyes drifting to Ash. "Didn't think it would be with a dog." Grace managed a small smile. "Didn't think I'd be back at all." Rachel tilted her head toward the open door. "You're lucky. Lila's here today. Might be a good match." Lila was 7, small for her age, with strawberry blonde curls that hung like tangled vines around her pale, freckled face. She sat cross-legged in the far corner of the room, cradling a stuffed elephant with one ear nearly torn off. Her eyes were fixed on the window, unblinking. Rachel explained quietly as they entered. "She hasn't spoken in 5 months, not since the night her father was arrested." Grace said nothing. She let Ash lead. At first, the pup didn't seem to notice the child. He sniffed the edges of the room bean bags, toy chests, the shelf of picture books, but then, almost imperceptibly, he paused. His head lifted, ears forward, and he saw her. Lila didn't move, but her grip on the elephant loosened. Ash approached slowly, not with the clumsy energy of a typical puppy, but with something careful, intuitive. He sat down just out of reach and waited. After 5 minutes, Lila reached out. Just once. She didn't touch him, but her hand hovered in the air, trembling slightly. Her mouth moved, no sound. Then, after another minute, she whispered it. "Like me." Grace turned sharply toward Rachel, who had frozen mid-breath. "Did you hear that?" the therapist asked, voice barely above a whisper. Grace nodded. Her chest ached. Lila's hand dropped to Ash's head. He didn't flinch. Didn't even blink. He leaned into the touch like it was something familiar. Something safe. Grace took a slow step back, then another, until she stood in the hallway, eyes burning. Rachel joined her. "That's the first word since September." Grace exhaled slowly. She said, "Like me." Rachel nodded. "It fits." Ash lay beside Lila for the next 20 minutes, eyes half closed, tail occasionally thumping once or twice against the mat. Lila didn't speak again, but she didn't stop touching him either, running her small fingers through the short fur along his back, tracing the scar still healing behind his ear. When it was time to leave, Lila didn't cry. She simply wrapped her arms around the stuffed elephant again, then looked up at Grace. "Will he come back?" Grace crouched down, leveling her gaze with hers. "If you want him to." Lila nodded once, firm and silent. They walked back through the mural-painted hallway. Grace didn't speak until they reached the truck. Once inside, Ash curled up on the seat, head against her leg. She looked down at him and whispered, "She's not the only one who sees it." He didn't move, but she could feel it, that quiet trust, the kind that doesn't need words to make itself known. That night, she added something new to the tin above the fireplace. A simple drawing Lila had handed her on their way out. A girl and a dog. No names, just a shared silhouette under a single moon. The wind had picked up again, whistling through the trees with an edge that hinted at another coming storm. Grace could smell the cold in the air, sharp, metallic, tinged with pine and distant smoke. Snow hadn't started falling yet, but it would. The sky had that quiet weight to it, the kind that warned those who knew how to listen. She stood at the window, coffee mug in hand, watching the tree line behind the cabin. Ash lay at her feet, head resting on her boot, eyes open but calm. The earlier visit to Maple Ridge still lingered in Grace's mind, Lila's voice, the way she had touched Ash's head as if she saw a mirror in his pain. Grace reached down to stroke his fur, and his tail gave a slow, reassuring thump. "You're good with people," she said, "even the broken ones." But the moment fractured when Ash suddenly stiffened. He rose, ears forward, body taut. A low rumble built in his throat, not a bark, not a growl, just tension made sound. Grace followed his gaze out the window and saw it too. A figure, moving near the edge of the woods, just past the slope where the creek wound in a lazy curve through the snow. He wasn't walking with purpose. He wandered, wobbled, occasionally stopped and turned as if unsure of where he was going or why. Grace's pulse ticked upward. The man was tall, broad-shouldered beneath a worn army green jacket. His gait was uneven, boots crunching loudly through the frost. She squinted. He wasn't from town. She would have remembered that frame, that posture, that aimlessness. Then he stepped into clearer light and her breath hitched. Todd Mercer. It had been years since she'd seen his face, but some things didn't fade. He looked older, deep-set eyes shadowed with sleeplessness, stubble graying along his chin, lips cracked from the cold. His coat hung too loosely on his frame. Grace didn't move from the window. Instead, she reached for her phone with slow, careful fingers. She angled the camera through the pane and snapped 3 shots. Face, full body. And then, through the slight bend of trees, the battered blue pickup he'd parked just off the trailhead. She zoomed in and captured the license plate. Ash let out a soft whine, not of fear, but warning. Grace crouched beside him. "It's okay. I see him too." She sent the photo to Ellie Madson's direct line, typing with the measured urgency she had learned during deployments. "Just saw Todd Mercer near my cabin. Wandering alone. Took photos. Sending plate now." The response was quick. "Received. Stay inside. Lock up. I'm headed your way." Grace double-checked the latch on the front door and drew the shades. Ash didn't settle. He sat by the woodpile near the hearth, watching the door as if it might rise up and strike. And Grace sat across from him, her fingers brushing over the handle of the hunting knife she kept tucked inside the side table drawer. The wind howled louder now, and the first flakes began to fall, gentle, uncertain. Her mind slipped backward unbidden. It had been the winter of 2016, in a remote Afghan village too small to make maps but big enough to hold a war. Grace had been part of the med team stationed near the border, a rotating crew of field personnel patched together from Army, Navy, and volunteers. That night, an IED had gone off near the North Market. Screams followed, and one child, just a boy, maybe 9, had staggered into their camp with blood streaming from his shoulder. She remembered his eyes, wide, unblinking, not with fear, but with a quiet sort of defiance. Grace had dropped everything to reach him. Bullets still cracked in the hills behind. Dust in her throat. Her hands red and slick. He hadn't cried, not even once. Later, when she sat beside his cot and he reached for her hand without a word, she knew something shifted inside her. Not just duty, something older. Instinctive. The need to protect what others had tried to destroy. She hadn't forgotten that feeling. The knock on the cabin door was firm but steady. Not like before. Grace opened it to find Sheriff Ellie Madsen standing with snow in her hair and a hand resting on her utility belt. Her breath fogged between words. "You were right. That's Mercer's plate. We've had him on a watch list since last spring, reported for suspected animal hoarding, but he skipped town before we could serve the warrant." Grace stepped back to let her in. Ash stayed close to her side, his head high, his muscles taut but restrained. Why would he be out here? Ellie shrugged out of her coat, revealing a Kevlar vest beneath. Could be he thought the storm bought him time. Or maybe he's circling something he lost. Her eyes flicked to Ash. "He's been here before," Grace said. "I can feel it." Ellie looked around the cabin bare, clean, but with signs of recent life. The water bowl by the hearth, the stack of journals, the paw print smudges on the floor. "We'll sweep the woods in daylight," she said, "but tonight I'm stationing a deputy down the road." Grace nodded. Appreciated. Before Ellie left, she turned back once more. "You know, your mother always said you had the fire in you. The kind that doesn't burn everything down, just bright enough to keep things alive." Grace gave a tight smile. "Guess I've still got some embers." That night, as the snow thickened and the fire crackled, Grace lay on the floor with Ash curled against her side. He didn't tremble. He didn't whimper. And Grace didn't dream of war. only of light flickering steady inside the cabin walls. The morning came with sirens, though muffled beneath thick snowfall. Grace stood at the tree line near the abandoned campground in North Bozeman, her breath ghosting into the icy air. Deputy Harland, a tall man with a barrel chest and soft eyes, motioned for her to stand clear as officers moved through the crumbling fence into what had once been a hunting outpost, now reduced to rusted trailers and splintered sheds. Ash moved beside her with quiet intensity, nose low to the ground. The wind whipped at the tall grass and frozen trash scattered through the site. Grace watched as he paused, sniffed a patch of churned earth near a tree stump, then moved on with purpose. He didn't hesitate. He knew where he was going. Ellie Madsen walked up beside Grace, bundled in a thick navy parka, her sheriff's badge dulled by frost. Her jaw was tight. "We found cages," she said grimly, "stacked behind one of the trailers. Empty now, but the stains on the wood floor aren't old. Some of the chains still have fur caught in the clasps." Grace didn't respond right away. Her eyes followed Ash, who had stopped in front of a sagging shed at the far end of the clearing. His ears were perked, his tail still. "Is that it?" Ellie asked. Grace nodded. "He's showing us." Inside, the shed smelled of rust, urine, and wet wood. The air was still, dead almost, as though breath had been stolen from the space long ago. Ash padded to the far corner, where a moldy wool blanket lay crumpled beneath a beam of winter light cutting through a hole in the roof. He circled it once, then sat. Grace's chest tightened. She could see it in the posture of his body, the way he didn't whine or cower but simply remained, as if paying tribute to something long endured. Ellie crouched and snapped several photos. "We'll bag this," she said. "The blanket might hold DNA." They stepped outside just as the wind shifted. A rusted pickup truck roared to life across the clearing. Todd Mercer, he must have been hiding in the woods, waiting. "Stop that vehicle," Ellie shouted. Harland and two others sprinted toward the truck. Todd gunned it, the tires skidding on the frozen dirt before gripping. Grace's heart pounded, hand going to the hilt of the knife at her hip, not for use, just reassurance. The truck didn't get far. An officer's cruiser, already positioned at the only narrow road leading out, blocked the path. Todd slammed the brakes and leapt out, hands raised halfway, his breath coming in wild puffs. "What's the charge?" he barked. "I didn't do anything." Ellie approached calmly, her voice hard. "You've got 3 unregistered burn pits, signs of animal neglect, and the owner of the dog you dumped has positively identified your vehicle." Todd shook his head, eyes narrowing. "That dog ain't mine." Ash stepped forward. He didn't bark, didn't lunge. Just stood, tail stiff, gaze locked. Grace narrowed her eyes. "He knows who you are." "That doesn't mean anything," Todd spat. "It's a damn stray." But then a small voice came from behind them. "Black truck." Driver's side mirror cracked. Back bumper dented on the left. Everyone turned. Lila stood beside Rachel Kim, bundled in a pink parka, her mittened hands clenched into fists. Rachel looked stunned. "I didn't want her to come," she whispered to Grace, "but she insisted." Lila stepped forward, her chin lifted. "That's his truck. I saw it. I remember the sound it made when it left." Todd's mouth twisted. "Who the hell is this?" Ellie cut him off. "She's a witness." Lila didn't flinch. Ellie nodded once to Harland. "Take him." As the cuffs clicked shut, Todd struggled, muttering curses under his breath. But no one listened. Back near the trailhead, Rachel wrapped Lila in a blanket and guided her toward her car. Grace knelt to say goodbye, but Lila surprised her by dropping to her knees in the snow and wrapping her arms tightly around Ash's neck. "You're the only one who didn't leave," she whispered into his fur. "Not even once." Ash licked her cheek gently. Grace stood back and watched, something warm rising in her throat. On the drive back to the cabin, she didn't speak. Not until they pulled up and Ash leapt out, tail wagging softly. He paused on the porch and turned to her, waiting. She looked at him differently now, not as a wounded thing, but as a survivor, a guide, even a guardian. "You're not just healing anymore," she said. "You're healing others." He didn't answer, of course. But the wind did, soft and steady, blowing through the pine and across the snow like a voice that had always been there, waiting to be heard. A year had passed. The snow still came in sheets, soft and heavy over the ridges of Bozeman, but everything felt warmer now inside Grace Whittaker's cabin. The walls were still made of old pine. The wood stove still groaned when lit, and the scent of coffee still clung to the air. But something had shifted. Life had returned in quiet layers. Not loud, not showy. Just steady, like the heartbeat of something that had survived the fire and decided to stay. Ash stood tall now, no longer the trembling shadow of a dog she'd found that day in the woods. At nearly 16 months old, his fur had filled out into a rich blend of black saddle and tan, his chest broader, posture alert, yet calm. His left ear still had a small nick from his past life, and sometimes his gaze would still linger too long on a slamming door or a boot too close. But more often, he greeted the world with measured confidence, like someone who had learned how to carry weight without being buried by it. He now wore a navy blue vest, embroidered on both sides with white block lettering, "Therapy Dog, Maple Ridge Program." Around his collar hung a small silver tag in the shape of a flame. Grace had engraved it herself. The sun that morning broke through the clouds in soft rays, casting a gentle gold across the porch. From the edge of the driveway, Grace stepped back to admire the finished sign, freshly hung on 2 carved wooden posts. The letters were simple but bold, chiseled with care and painted with a rich brown stain. Here, no life is forgotten. Not even the smallest. The sign had taken months to finish. Not for lack of time, but because she wanted to get it right. The wood came from an old spruce that had fallen naturally near her cabin. Ash had been the one to find it, circling the base until Grace took notice. She cut it herself, sanded it by hand, and carved it with a set of tools Kyle had left behind in a crate marked, "Leave me something to fix." Inside the cabin, final preparations were underway. Folding chairs lined the walls, children's artwork covered one side of the entryway, and a long table held pots of hot cider, homemade muffins, and a sign-up sheet titled "Veterans and Kids Story Hour." Dr. Nolan Reyes arrived first, pulling up in his battered Ford and stepping out with his usual quiet gait. He wore a clean sweater over a collared shirt, the sleeves rolled to his forearms, and a small box tucked under one arm. "I brought copies," he said, "fresh from the print shop." Inside the box were paperbacks, dozens of them, all bearing the same title on the cover, "Ash, the Dog Who Waited" by Grace Whittaker. Grace ran a hand along the matte cover. "You didn't have to rush it." "I didn't. You just waited too long to finish it." He gave her a knowing smile before heading inside. A half-hour later, Ellie Madsen arrived in uniform but with her badge tucked into her pocket, opting for flannel and jeans instead. Her hair, usually pulled tight, fell in soft waves around her shoulders. "Got traffic cones up at the turnoff," she said. "Should keep folks from parking on your mailbox." Grace laughed softly. "Thanks, Sheriff. Today, just Ellie." As guests began to trickle in, veterans in worn jackets, parents guiding wide-eyed children through snowbanks, Ash walked among them like he belonged. He paused beside wheelchairs, nudged the hands of silent boys, curled up at the feet of widowed grandmothers. Lila arrived just after noon, hand in hand with her mother, Sandra, a tall woman with tired eyes and a kindness worn like an old sweater. Lila's curls had grown longer, her cheeks rosier. She wore a small pin on her jacket shaped like a dog's paw. When she saw Ash, she didn't run. She simply knelt in the snow and whispered, "I missed you." Ash leaned into her, his vest brushing against her arm like the flap of a familiar storybook. Sandra approached Grace quietly. "She doesn't have nightmares anymore." Grace smiled. "Neither does he." The day stretched on with music, laughter, and stories, some heavy, some gentle. Veterans spoke about memories they hadn't shared in decades. Children listened with wide eyes. Some colored pictures of Ash. Others asked if he had a middle name. Later, as the crowd thinned and the sky deepened to dusk, Grace sat on the porch steps, a wool blanket wrapped around her legs. Ash rested beside her, his head on her knee, watching the last few guests drive down the snow-packed road. She ran her fingers along his back. "You know," she said quietly, "I used to think Kyle was the last light I'd ever have." Ash shifted slightly, his amber eyes lifting to meet hers. "But now, I think, maybe you were sent to remind me there's more." She leaned down, forehead pressed against his. "Kyle was the first light, and now you're the one that stayed." Ash let out a breath warm and steady, and the wind moved through the trees with the softness of a lullaby. Not far behind them, the wooden sign creaked slightly in the breeze, catching the last golden edge of sunset. Sometimes God doesn't speak through thunder or part the skies to deliver a miracle. Sometimes he sends it in silence, wrapped in fur, scarred but surviving, arriving not with a bark but with a heartbeat still willing to trust. Ash wasn't just a dog left in the snow. He was a second chance. For Grace, for Lila. For everyone who thought their story had ended long before it was meant to. Because when we choose to protect the broken, we begin to heal what's shattered within ourselves. When we reach out, whether to a frightened child or a trembling dog, we carry God's grace into the world with hands that say, "You're still worthy of love." Maybe that's how God works best. Not in grand displays, but in quiet faithfulness. In those who stay. In those who listen. In those who return, even after being abandoned. If this story moved your heart, please share it with someone who needs to believe again. Leave a comment below and tell us about the animal or person who changed your life. Subscribe to hear more true stories of hope, healing, and the quiet power of love. And may God bless you for every life you've ever helped, whether it walked on 2 legs or 4. If you believe no life is too small to matter, comment Amen below.